I'm a composer. Elfriede Jelinek has often said this in interviews. And in saying so, she does not only allude to the fact that she set texts to music in the 1960s, and indeed, we have already heard two of her songs today, most recently Meine Klage. But she also refers to her fundamental writing process, namely her musical compositional approach to linguistic material. Elfriede Jelinek, with both her special affinity to music and her musical writing, is not alone in the Austrian literature tradition. Indeed, musicality is often cited as a central characteristic of Austrian literature, particularly after 1945. I refer here not only to authors such as Gerhard Rühm, Ingeborg Bachmann, Thomas Bernhard, and Gerd Jonke, but also to the younger generation of authors in Austria, which includes Sophie Reyer, Lydia Haider, or Thomas Köck, all of whom have a special relationship to music. In connection with Jelinek's musicality, I would also like to quote the justification given by the Swedish Academy for awarding Jelinek the 2004 Nobel Prize for Literature, which goes as follows. For her musical flow of voices and countervoices in novels and plays, that with extraordinary linguistic zeal you reveal the absurdity of society's clichés and their subjugating power. A fundamental compositional principle of Jelinek's work is hinted at here. The Swedish Academy refers to a musical flow of voices and countervoices, thereby picking up on the musical processing of these voices and countervoicing in Jelinek's texts. I would like to warn against a simple transfer of musical terms to literature, because music and language are two related media, but they are not necessarily analogous. In my opinion, however, an examination of Jelinek's texts in terms of the musical introduces new perspectives for the analysis of form and of structure. In Jelinek's work, the musical can be found, first of all, in the microstructure of the texts, in the forms of activation of the tonal potential of individual speech particles, and in the continuation and rebounding of phonetic material. In addition, there is another, and in my opinion, an extremely productive approach that the musicologist Birgit Lodes has taken. She derives Jelinek's style of writing from the playing of the organ. The focal instrument of Jelinek's studies was the organ, an instrument with very conservative connotations. But the organ is also an instrument of polyphony and of improvisation. A basic theme is carried forward and varied. That Jelinek's procedure of increasingly compacting certain linguistic turns of phrase by means of improvisational writing could have its origins here is, in my opinion, an extremely interesting research approach. Jelinek's texts, her theater texts in particular, are also works that exhibit this polyphony. They are constituted by varying, mutually confirming or contradictory voices that come into conflict with each other, rather than by psychological defined characters. In a conventional dramatic text, voices follow one another and are oriented to a goal. But Jelinek's multi-voiced, polyphonic writing creates the impression of a simultaneity of voices. The term choral has also repeatedly been applied for this form. One could therefore describe Jelinek's texts as speech scores. I would also like to refer to specific works by Jelinek in connection with her compositional language work. For example, in her theater texts in recent years, we find recurring musical forms functioning as basic structural principles. I offer here 3 examples. In Jelinek's theater text Kein Licht, the voices are the first and second violins, that is, 2 instruments in a string quartet. The scene Wotan Brünnhilde from Wagner's Die Walküre, the second part of his tetralogy, Der Ring des Nibelungen, forms the basis of Jelinek's theater text Rheingold, whose title quotes the first part of Der Ring des Nibelungen, das Rheingold. Whether there are references to Wagner's leitmotif technique in Jelinek's work, alongside thematic references to Wagner's operas, would also be an interesting research question for the future. For in Jelinek's work, as in Wagner's, there is a procedure of creating a kind of network of motifs by means of combining and superimposing forms of repetition and variation, thereby producing a complex space-time structure. Thus, in Jelinek's work too, times become space, to quote a central phrase from Wagner's Parsifal. In German, zum Raum wird hier die Zeit. The foundation of Jelinek's Winterreise theater text, which is still of interest to us today, is the song cycle of the same name by Franz Schubert. The works of Schubert, Jelinek's favorite composer, mostly revolve around one keynote, in contrast to Ludwig van Beethoven, for example, whose music is always oriented towards a goal, where linearity, dynamics, and process are important. For Schubert, it is all about a state, about a concise basic motive that is revolved around again and again. Jelinek's form could also be described in terms of this structure. Her writing also revolves around certain central concepts. In her case, there is equally no orientation towards a goal. Her works can therefore be described not only as Textflächen, text surfaces, but also as Klangflächen, sound surfaces.